Well, it's in a time of war when you need a critical, independent journalism in a democracy the most. And once again, I think, if we look at the history of especially post-World War II American conflicts, it's at time of war that the American journalism industry and community has failed us most. And I think it's particularly important this time. The questions you would ask of journalism during wartime are not unlike you would ask in any time when you want a functioning democracy. That is a democracy where citizens actually have meaningful input into the formation of policy, not simply ratifying policies made by elites. So what do you need from journalists? Well, you need basically three things. You need an independent flow of information that you can trust, that has some accuracy, something other than simply government information. You need a historical and political context into which to put that information, because random facts mean nothing to most people without some framework. And finally, you need the widest range of opinion that's circulating in the culture so that people have, in a sense, something to rub up against, somewhere to test their own ideas. And on all three of those things, I think the American media has failed, and I think failed miserably this time around. I would probably make a distinction between television coverage and the newspaper coverage. The newspaper coverage, as it often is somewhat more subtle, nuanced, certainly deeper and richer, but still framed in many of the same ways. The television coverage, I have to say, has been not just bad. I think the television journalists have been unethical. I think the way in which the television journalists have abandoned any sense of neutrality. Of course, the idea that journalists are ever neutral or objective is complicated, and one can argue about that. But here we have journalists who pretend to be neutral and objective journalists, who go on national television and say things, as Dan Rather did on the David Letterman show, wherever the president wants me, I'm there. I'll line up where I'm told to be. Cokie Roberts, a well-known NPR correspondent and now ABC commentator, said again on a talk show, you know, I'm so impressed with the military people. She made a joke about how many medals they have on their uniforms, and she can't even pick them up. And so she said, when they tell me things, I tend to believe it. So on television, you have journalists essentially saying, we have given up, we have abandoned our role as independent gatherers of information. We are simply conduits for government information. And I see that playing out all over the place. So on the first point, that we need this independent source of information, I think the journalists themselves are almost admitting that they are not providing that. I've seen amazing things. I've seen Tom Brokaw, for instance, or Dan Rather, they tend to blend together after a while, these anchors, say that there were conflicting claims from the Taliban about civilian casualties and then from the U.S. military. And he said, of course, we have no way to adjudicate this. We don't know. But he said, we have no reason to disbelieve the military. Well, if you look at the last 56 years of American history after World War II, there is every reason to disbelieve the U.S. military. They have lied to the American public and to American journalists over and over again. So at the very least, the kind of bottom line skepticism in information collection that you want from journalists, many of them have abandoned, and not only abandoned, but abandoned explicitly. So on that first count, I think the journalists have a lot to answer for. On the second one, the historical and political context, again, I think the failure is quite profound. I must say it's a little better than it was during the Gulf War in 1991, where I think it was an utter and total failure. They were at least asking the why do they hate us question, where, you know, in the politics and the history of these regions of the Middle East and Central Asia, where does this antipathy toward the United States come from? The problem is the answers they're giving, I think, are terribly superficial, again, reflecting a sort of ideological commitment to the American government and to the American mythology about our role in the world. What I often just call American exceptionalism, this notion that America, by definition, does good in the world. So whatever bad might happen because of American policy must be an accident, a miscalculation. So the historical and political context, I think, has been missing also. And to say this, of course, doesn't mean they never take up these questions. There have been some notable exceptions to this. I've seen Arab and Muslim commentators, for instance, being allowed to talk. But again, here, the importance is the pattern, right? It's not just, is there occasionally a dissident voice allowed in, but what is the sort of drumbeat over and over again? And of course, that framing of the historical and political context allows those alternative points of view very rarely. On the final point, the need for the U.S. media to provide the widest range of opinion available in the culture so people can test out their own opinions, I think here the failure is probably most profound. If you look at the people who really provide the analysis, they're taking the facts and framing them for us. Who are those expert commentators, especially again on television? Well, they're former generals, they're retired military officers. These people are actually now on the payroll of these networks. So they're not even being brought in as outside commentators. They are simply staff of the networks who are framing everything we see, ex-intelligence officials, the former director of the CIA, for instance, or my favorite category of terrorism expert, which I still have no idea what constitutes one as a terrorism expert. I've often think that if you simply print up business cards that say terrorism expert, you become one. And I think, several people have pointed out probably the most ironic, if not, actually sickening one of these, which is Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, former National Security Advisor, someone who is at the core of some of the most atrocious American military and covert operations around the world, is being brought on over and over again and being relied on as someone who can frame the question of why do they hate us. Well, one of the answers in the Middle East is why do they hate us is because the policies of Henry Kissinger in the Nixon and Ford administrations are central to why they hate us. So you're bringing in the very people who I would argue are at the core of the problem. Now, it doesn't mean that Henry Kissinger's voice should never be heard. It means where are the people to balance that? Where is that diverse range of opinion? Well, it's not on the networks for the most part. And, those of us who have actually been on, for instance, I was on the O'Reilly Factor for all of 6 minutes. 5 minutes of it was Bill O'Reilly shouting over me. To occasionally put on an alternative perspective, a dissident voice, and then claim you have done your job is, of course, ridiculous. That it is, again, the patterns of coverage we have to see, the patterns of opinion being offered, the patterns of analysis that are given to us as the way to think. And, it's important to realize that people are getting other sources of information now increasingly with the internet. But again, the American television networks provide the dominant flow of information to this culture. The vast majority of people are not reading newspapers in depth. They're not spending 3 hours a day on the web. It would be hard to imagine that given how busy people's lives are. If you're working 2 jobs, trying to raise a family, trying to make ends meet, the idea that you're going to, in depth, go for that information isn't really very feasible. So again, we have to look at what are these patterns of coverage in the dominant media. And that's why I think, again, the television journalists especially have a lot to answer for. And I believe their conduct is, in fact, not only unprofessional, I believe it's unethical. If, in fact, in a modern democracy, their claim to special status, their claim to having a place, a protected place under the First Amendment, depends on their ability to work that magic, in a sense, that a democracy needs, which is not only an informed public, but a public that is active and engaged. And the way in which this news is presented and the way in which the American news media engages the audience, I think, in fact, does just the opposite. It produces a passive, uninformed public.